Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babel on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Vav of Masechta Ayruvin, Daf 6, on our journey through Ayruvin. Let's do an outline of the page. So the first bunch of the Daf talks about breaches in the side of a mavui. How large can that breach be before it becomes a problem? Then we get into the discussion of a mavui hamefulash. Up until now, all of the mavuis we've been discussing were mavui sasums, closed mavuis, right? Mavuis that are dead ends. So they're open on one end to the Rishus Harabim, but the other end is a dead end. What if they're open on both ends to Rishus Harabim, to two parallel Rishus Harabims? So what do you have to do in order to be able to carry in there? Can you just put up one lechi? Is that enough? Put up one lechi at one end? Well, let's find out. Yeah, that's like the main thrust. Let's just say that's the main thrust of the daf. Friends, let's get started. All the way at the bottom of daf Hey Amud Beis, 2 lines from the bottom. Amar Rav Chanan bar Rava. Amar Rav says Rav Chanan bar Rava, in the name of Rav. Mavui shenifratz mitzido be'eser meirosho be'arba'a. So if you have a mavui, okay? So our regular old mavui, you got Main Street, turn off of Main Street into your alleyway. On either side of the alleyway, you can go into a chutzner, dead end in the back, standard mavui. Actually, I take that back just a tiny bit. Not standard mavui for the most part. But in this mavui, there's actually one additional piece, which is that it's a very wide mavui, okay? It's 20 amis wide. And therefore, as the Mishnah told us on Daf Beis Amud Aleph, the first Mishnah said that if it's larger than 10 amis, if it's wider than 10 amis, you gotta shrink it. So what they did was they built a wall 10 amis, right? So the mavui was 20 amis wide. Then they built a wall 10 amis wide so that now the width of the mavui is no longer wider than 10 amis. So what Rav Chanan bar Rava seems to be saying in the name of Rav is that mavui shenifratz mitzido, that if you have a mavui that there is a breach in the wall from one of the side walls, well then be'eser. Well, as long as it's within 10, I believe it's 10 amis or less. I think it would have to be more than 10 amis in order to disqualify it. But as long as it's 10 amos or less of a breach, well then the mavui remains acceptable. Meirosho be'arba'a. However, if in this wall that they built in the front of the mavui, in order to shrink the width, of the opening, there is a breach, well then the breach can only have a maximum size of, it would have to be less than 4 tefachim. Once it's 4 tefachim, it's already going to be a problem. Now, the Gemara asks, Ma'ishna mitzido be'eser de'amar pischahu meirosho nami nema pischahu. But the Gemara asks, why should there be a difference between the side wall and the front wall? It's a wall. If we say with the side wall that if there's a breach of 10 amis, it's acceptable, because as the Gemara says, pischahu, it's a pesach as opposed to a pirza. If it's more than 10 amis, then it's a pirza, then it's a breach. As long as it's 10 amis or less, it's a pesach, it's a doorway. So how come in the side it's considered a doorway, yet when it comes to this front wall, you only have up to 4 tefachim? What's the difference? Why is one a pesach and one's a pirza? Right? If you have, let's say, a 5 amma breach in the wall, is it considered a pesach? Yet that same 5 amma breach in the front is considered a pirza because it's more than 4 tefachim. So, Amar Rav Huna Brei Rav Yoshua says, Rav Huna Brei Rav Yoshua, he says, you're right. You're 1,000% right. Kugon shenifratz bekeren zavis, the pischa bekeren zavis lo avde inshe. When Rav Chanan bar Rava says in the name of Rav that in the front you have only up to 4 tefachim, but if the breach is 4 tefachim, it's a problem. It doesn't mean on the front wall. If you built a wall on the front, then the wall on the front is no different than the wall on the sides. and as long as it's 10 amas or less, it'll be considered a doorway, not a breach. When Rav Chanan bar Rava says in the name of Rav that once a breach is 4 tfachim, it is a problem, it's talking about on the corners, like we saw Rav Yosef mentioned the corners the other day. Was it yesterday already? Was it the day before? Who can remember anymore? Maybe it was yesterday already. I think it was yesterday. So yeah, exactly, it was yesterday. So talking about the corners, right? If you have, so you have this mavui, and there are 90-degree angles, and if in one of the corners there becomes a breach that's 4 amas, 4 tfachim, so then that would be considered a breach, because people don't normally make a pesach in the corner. People make a pesach in, within the length of the wall. They're not usually going to make the pesach in the corner. And therefore, if there's a breach in the corner, the size of 4 tfachim, that is already going to pass the mavui. However, if there's a breach in one of the side walls, or even in the front wall, you have up to 10 amas, it would still be considered a pesach. Beseder. Friends, what's the main point of Rav Chanan bar Rava in the name of Rav? That when you have a mavui, and you have a breach in the mavui, then, forget about the walls, the corners, right? Just in the wall, you have a breach in the mavui. So that breach can be 10 amos or less. More than 10 amos, it's a pirza and it causes problems. But 10 amos or smaller is a pesach, and that's acceptable, according to Rav Chanan bar Rava in the name of Rav. Rav Huna Amar. Now Rav Huna argues on Rav Chanan bar Rava, and he says echad zeh ve'echad zeh be'arba'a. And he says no. When it comes to a breach in a mavui, whether it's the corner, whether it's the front, whether it's the back, whether it's the sides, 4 tfachim. That's it. If there is a breach in a mavui, 4 tfachim or more, problem. It's going to be a problem for your mavui. V'chein amalei Rav Huna l'Rav Chanan bar Rava. And guess what Rav Huna said to Rav Chanan bar Rava? Lo tiflog alai. Don't argue on me. Rav Huna says to Rav Chanan bar Rava, he says, don't argue on me. D'Rav ikla l'damcharia ve'avid uvda kavasi. Because Rav, and after all, we know that Rav Huna was a student of Rav. It was Taka Gemara in Shabbos somewhere. It said explicitly, Rav Huna was a student of Rav. He was one of the main students of Rav. Rav Chanan bar Rava, I think he may have just been a child of Rava, which is interesting because there was Taka, a note. There was Taka, a note. Where was this note? Where was this note? I had certainly highlighted it. It was like an interesting note somewhere that said that, here it is, on Daf Hamud Beis. There's a note that says, Dafilu Rava lo ra'es Rav Huna. That Rava would have never, it was Daf Hamud Beis. There's a note over there that says that Rava would have never have seen Rav Huna, so let alone his son Rav Chanan. So it's interesting that they're arguing and that they're talking to each other, unless Rav Chanan bar Rava isn't actually a child of Rava, or I don't know. Friends, back to the Gemara. Rav Huna says to Rav Chanan bar Rava, he says, Lo tiflog aloi, don't argue on me. To Rav Ikla l'damcharia v'avid uvda kavasi, because Rav visited Damcharia and there was a breach in their mavui, and it was less than 10 amis, but more than 4 tfachim, and he said it's a problem. So Rav Huna says, you see, Rav, what I'm saying is really Rav's opinion. Amalei, to which Rav Chanan bar Rava responds to Rav Huna, and he says, Rav bikamatza v'gader begeder. Rav he found a field with a breach in the wall and he was fixing it. Meaning, don't get confused by the breach in the wall and the breach in the mavui. It's a metaphor. Rav Chanan bar Rava was just saying that the people in Damcharia were shtikol amaratzim. People in Damcharia, Rav was concerned that if he would tell them that it's a kosher breach, meaning, again, this is Rav Chanan bar Rava responding to Rav Huna regarding that story that happened in Damcharia, where there was a breach the size of 4 tfachim in their mavui, and Rav said that it's a problem. Rav Chanan bar Rava says that really Rav's opinion is that a breach in the wall of a mavui is up until, it has to be more than 10 amas. the breach in order for it to be a problem. So how do you explain what he paskin for the people of Damcharia? The people in Damcharia were Amoratzim. They weren't very makbid on halacha, and therefore, as a siag, as like a fence around the Torah, as a precaution, Rav told them that even though the breach is only for tfachim, he said that they have to fix it, and it's a problem. But, says Rav Chanan bar Rava, if it was in a more learned place, the fact of the matter is that the halacha is that a breach, as long as it's 10 amis or less, would be acceptable. Okay, that's the machlokas between Rav Chanan bar Rava and Rav Huna regarding a breach in the wall of a mavui. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, kavase de Rav Huna mistavra. Now says Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak that it makes sense to say that Rav Huna is the correct opinion over here. That a breach in the wall of a mavui that is 4 tfachim wide would already be considered a breach according to Rav. How come? The Idmar, it was stated, mavui akum, a slanted mavui. Who can tell me what a slanted mavui is? So a slanted mavui, so if you look on page 6a, I'm going to try to hopefully keep the numbers here when I take the photos. Also, I hope that these diagrams are effective. If they're not so easy to see or to read or whatever, maybe we could find a better solution. But anyways, this diagram is here on daf 6a1 in the art scroll. We're talking about the bottom right diagram. Now, as you can see, we're talking about a mavui that is in L shape, kind of like an inverted L, but it's an L-shaped mavui, right? Basically, in this diagram, you could see that you have, let's say, a mavui on the south side of this sort of collection of chatzeros and stuff. So you have, let's say, Main Street that is running east-west, okay? And therefore, it's basically going to be running on the south side of this square chatzer area. Now, you can turn northward into this mavui, okay, into this alleyway, go all the way to the end, and then make a left to turn westward towards another, an exit on another Rishus Harabim on Main Street 2, which is going north-south, right? So basically, you have a mavui that is in an L shape. You can turn off of Main Street into this mavui, walk all the way to the end, make a left, and then exit the mavui on Main Street 2. So you can basically turn off of Main Street on the south side of this enclosure, walk northward to the end, make a left, and then exit the mavui on the west side of this enclosed area. I hope that that was clear enough. But if you're looking at the diagram, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. So basically, the idea here is that we actually treat this as 2 separate mavuis, okay? We don't treat this as one long L-shaped mavui. We treat this as 2 mavuis. We have the one mavui that, turns off of, we'll call them, I guess, Main Street 1 and Main Street 2. So you have one mavui that you turn off of Main Street 1 and you walk through that alleyway till the end of it, until you get to the corner. That's mavui number 1. And then mavui number 2 is, you turn off of Main Street 2 into that mavui, and then you walk till that one till you get to the corner. And then they, meet at the corner. Okay, they converge at the corner. So we basically treat it like 2 separate mavuis that converge at the corner. Okay, so that is what we're talking about. So Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak kavase de Rav Huna mistavra, says Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak that lamaise it makes sense to say that Rav Huna has the correct opinion of Rav, which is that a breach in a mavui that is 4 tfachim wide is already going to consider a breach that would be significant. The itmar, as it was stated, mavui akum, when you have this L-shaped mavui, that it's considered that we basically have 2 mavuis that converge in a 90-degree angle at the middle. Rav Amar tarasu kimefulash. So Rav says that we have to treat each of these 2 mavuis like they are mavui mefulash, as opposed to mavui sasum, right? A mavui sasum is a dead-end mavui, Rav says that we don't treat these two mavuis as dead-end mavuis. Rather, we treat them as open mavuis. And we're going to learn later on this daf what the nafkaminas are, how you can set up an open mavui so that you can carry in that. It's different than the mavui sasum that we've been talking about until now, that you just put a lechi and a korah. So Rav says that we have to treat these two converging mavuis as two mavui mefulashes. Shmuel Amar Tarasu Kisasum. Shmuel says that we can treat each mavui as a mavui sasum, as if they are both closed, which means that to enable carrying in those mavuis, all you would have to do is put a lechi on the entrance of each of the two mavuis, and you can now carry in those mavuis. Now, b'mayaskina. Now, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak wants to say, what are we talking about? How, when these two mavuis converge, essentially there is a breach in the mavui, right? Meaning, let's just take Main Street 1, right, which is at the bottom of the diagram, which runs west, east, and you would turn northward into the mavui. So, Main Street 1. So, you turn into the mavui, and you get to the very end. What happens when you get to the very end? There's a big freaking breach over there. A big breach that you can turn left into to go to mavui number 2. So, clearly, this isn't a completely dead-end mavui, right? Because there is a big breach at the end of it where you can turn left into the other mavui. So the question is, how big is this breach that you can walk through to get to the second mavui, to turn left into the second mavui? Ilema biyoser me'eser. If we're saying that this breach, that this second mavui that you're turning into is more than 10 amis, then how could Shmuel possibly say that this mavui is a mavui sasum? Right? How could Shmuel possibly say that these two mavuis are each considered like a closed mavui if the breach at the end is more than 10 amis? Everyone would agree that 10 amis already is considered a breach. Rather, it's talking about where it's exactly 10 or less. Right? Meaning, it's talking about a breach that is less than 10 amis. And what are we saying? We're saying that according to Rav, right, so we're talking about a mavui, that at the end, the area where you could turn into the next mavui is less than 10 amis, because if it was more than 10 amis, Shmuel can't possibly say it's a mavui sasum. So we're talking about where it's less than 10 amis, and still, Rav is saying that it's a mavui mefulash, that this breach is significant, and therefore we have to treat these two mavuis like each one is a mavui mefulash, because this breach, even though it's less than 10 amis, is already considered a significant breach. So v'ka'amar Rav tarasu k'mefulash, and Rav is saying that this breach at the end of each mavui makes them a mavui mefulash, and we prove that it's smaller than 10 amis. So we see that when you have a breach in the side of a mavui, it is already considered a breach once it's 4 tfachim, and that is why Rav considers these two converging mavuis to each be a mavui mefulash. Rav Chanan bar Rava responds, and he says, that's a different case. I agree that in that case, Rav would say that a breach would be considered significant at 4 tfachim. I agree. Lots of people pass through that breach, right? This is talking about two converging mavuis that people walk out of Rishus HaRabim, walk from Rishus HaRabim into this mavui. There are chatzeros that open up into this mavui. People are walking there. It's common for people to walk through this L-shaped mavui, and for that reason, Rav Chanan bar Rav says, I agree that this breach would already be significant by 4 tfachim. Rav Chanan bar Rava says, when I say that a breach is only significant once it's more than 10 amos, that is in a place where you don't have many people walking through over there. Where there aren't so many people walking through, then the breach can be as wide as 10 amos. But then what does that imply? Does that imply then that Rav Huna argues on Rav Chanan bar Rava and says that even in a place where there aren't many people walking over there, still 4 tfachim would be enough to make it a breach. But Ma'ishnami de Rabbi Ami Rabbi Asi. But why should we assume that Rav Huna holds differently than Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi? What did we see? What's Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi? We saw them yesterday. That with that mavui, that you walk into it, and there's a korah, and then there's 4 tfachim of wall, and then a big geshmaka breach. We say that as long as the breach is 10 amas or less, so then it's considered a Pesach and it's fine. And we have no reason to assume that Rav Huna should disagree with that. So, what's going on? Meaning, on the one hand, we have Rav Chanan bar Rav, who's saying that he agrees that a breach of 4 tfachim would be significant when it's a place when lots of people walk there and walk through that breach. Rav Chanan bar Rav, I don't know if I said Rav Chanan bar Rav, but I meant Rav Chanan bar Rava. He's arguing that when Rav says that a breach can be 10 up to and including 10 amas wide, that is only where people aren't necessarily going to pass through it all the time. Which implies that Rav Huna would say that even in a place where people don't pass through it all the time, let's say because it's inconvenient to get there, so Rav Huna would still say that a breach is by 4 tfachim. But why should we assume that Rav Huna disagrees with Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi, who says that when you have a breach in the side of a wall, it can be up to and including 10 amas wide? So Hasam De'ika Gidude Achadeleka Gidude. So the Gemara answers that Rav Huna does agree with Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi, and he does agree that in their case, a breach can be up to and including 10 amas wide. However, their case was unique. In the case of Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi, it's talking about where the wall kind of collapsed, but not entirely. There were still 3 or 4 tfachim where there were still stones there. And you kind of had to hop the fence. It wasn't super convenient to get into this mavui. So sure, you can get into the mavui, but you'd have to do it would take a little bit of effort. So in that case, yeah, Rav Huna does agree with Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi that it would only be considered a breach if it's wider than 10 amas. Where Rav Huna argues that 4 tfachim would already be significant to be a breach, that is where it's that's in a case where it's inconvenient to get there, but also once you're there, you could just walk right in. So in that case, he would say that 4 tfachim would be enough. So both Rav Chanan bar Rava and Rav Huna agree that if it's a place where lots of people are going to walk through, such as this L-shaped mavui, where people walk through that breach to get from one mavui to the other mavui, well, then 4 tfachim is already going to be considered a breach, right? Rav Chanan bar Rava and Rav Huna agree that when it comes to a breach in the side of a mavui where it's not very convenient to walk through that breach, well, even Rav Huna is going to admit that the breach can be up to 10 amas wide, or up to and including 10 amas wide, as long as it's not so easy to get through that breach, such like Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi's example, when there was still like 3 or 4 tfachim of stone that you'd have to climb over. Where Rav Chanan bar Rava and Rav Huna disagree is when you have a breach that is not very convenient to get to this breach. Let's say you have to walk through a trashy area or whatever it is, but once you get there, you can walk right in. Rav Huna would say, since you could walk right in, 4 tfachim would already be considered a breach. Rav Chanan bar Rava says, no, since it's difficult to get there, it would only be considered a breach if it is larger than 10 amas. Okay, I think that was the hardest part of today's daf. I think. Let's go weiter. Maybe you guys will tell me later if I was right. Taner Rabbanan. Ketzad ma'arvin derech reshus harabim. So this is interesting. How do you make an Eruv in reshus harabim? Meaning, if you have reshus harabim and you want to carry there. So like, here is, okay. Where are we? Okay, yeah, that's fine. Or, you know what, okay, yeah, we can use this one, fine. So look at the diagram on 6A3, okay? So you kind of see on the top right, looks kind of like a flag, but basically what you have is you have a road and it's surrounded on both sides by houses. The idea is that you have like a highway that's running through a town. Okay, you have a highway. The highway is a Rosh Hashanah, and it's running through a town. So basically it's got walls on both sides of the highway, the walls of the town. But it's a Rosh Hashanah, and you want to be able to carry in that area. So what can you do? Or can you do anything? So right now, at least at this point in the Gemara is assuming that you can theoretically do something to this Rosh Hashanah to enable you to carry over there. Okay? So the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, Ketzid Ma'arvin Derech Rosh Hashanah. How can you make an Eruv in Rosh Hashanah? How can you do something to this Rosh Hashanah to enable you to carry over there? So Oset Tzuras HaPesach Mikan V'lechi V'kora Mikan. So the Tanna Kama says, what you would do is, you would remember, it's a highway that's running through a town and there are walls on either side. So what you would do is, on one of the open ends of the, this area that has, a wall, let's say on the east side and the west side. So what you do is you would build a Tzuras HaPesach when you kind of enter into that walled off area, the walls on either side. So when you come into that area, so then you would build a Tzuras HaPesach. Basically, you would build a post on either side of the entrance with a crossbeam across it. That's a Tzuras HaPesach. Then, you would build on one end a Tzuras HaPesach, and then on the other end, you can just have a lechi or a korah, and now you would be able to carry in this Rishus Harabim. Chananya Omer. Now Chananya quotes machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai Omrim osedelis mikan v'delis mikan shuyotze v'nichnas noel. So Beis Shammai is pretty charif. Beis Shammai says that if you want to carry in this Rishus Harabim, you mamash have to put a door on either side, on either open end of this Rishus Harabim, and you have to close the door. Basically completely enclose this area. And if you want to leave, you open the door and you close it behind you. Beis Hillel omrim osedelis mikan v'lechi v'kor mikan. Beis Hillel is sort of the in-between opinion. So whereas the Tanna Kama said you just have to build a Tzuras HaPesach on one side and a lechi and a korah on the other. Beis Shammai says that you mamash have to build a full door on both sides. Beis Hillel says you build a door on one side and then on the other side you can have a lechi or a korah. Okay? Fine. So that's the machlok between the Tanna Kama and Chananya, who quotes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Now the Gemara asks, Rishus Harabim Mimi Arva, can you actually make an Eruv in Rishus Harabim? Is there anything that you could do in Mamash or Rishus Harabim to enable you to carry Dartin? V'atanya, we learn in a brayso, Yasser Aken Amar Rabbi Yidel, says Rabbi Yehuda, Mi shahayu lo shnei batim mishnei tzidei Rishus Harabim. So if you have a highway, Rishus Harabim, and on either side of the highway you have a guy owns a house on either side of Rishus Harabim, right? You can see it in the diagram on 6B1 on the top left. You see that road in the middle of the Nevada desert, and right, isn't there like a Gucci store in the middle of like the Nevada desert or something like that? Anyways, so this guy's got a house on either side of the highway. Okay, so let's say he wants to carry there. So you can even see that in that same diagram, a lechi when you enter into one of the houses, meaning to the area of one of the houses, then a lechi at the other end of that house. And by putting up those two lechis, you can now carry therein. So somebody who has two houses on either side of Rishus Harabim, of this highway. So he puts one lechi, at the beginning of when you would enter into the area of one of the houses, and then a lechi on the other side of that house. Or you could put a crossbeam from house to house, again, when you would begin passing through that area, as well as when you leave. Now you can carry whatever you want in the middle. To which the Rabbanim responded to Rabbi Yehuda, and they said, you can't do that. You can't make an Eruv in Rishus Harabim. You can't do anything to Mamish or Rishus Harabim to enable you to carry over there. So we see that you cannot do anything to enable carrying in Rishus, in something that's mamish Rishus Harabim. V'chitema b'chachud lo mi'arva hab'delasos mi'arva. But maybe you'll say that no, what the Chachamim are saying to Rabbi Yehuda, they're not saying that it's impossible there's no possible way to be able to carry in Rishus Harabim. No, that is not what the Chachamim are saying. Maybe the Chachamim are just saying to Rabbi Yehuda, you can't just put up a lechi on either side of one of the houses and think that that's enough. No way, no how. Maybe you have to do at least like Beis Hillel, and put up a door. So you can make a Eruv, you just can't do it with two lechis. Let's read that again. But Rabbi Bar Chana said the name of Rabbi Yochanan that when it comes to Yerushalayim, if not for the fact, so what they're assuming is that Jerusalem had a main Rishus Harabim thoroughfare that went straight through the city. However, an additional feature of Yerushalayim was that there were these big bulky gates on either end of the thoroughfare. And therefore, and they would close those gates every night. And because they would mamish close those gates every night and enclose the entire Jerusalem, that is what allows you to carry in there on Shabbos, or at least to be able to make an Eruv to be able to carry in there on Shabbos. Right? So we see that in order to make to be able to carry, you can't just put up a lechi or a korah, and you can't even just put up one door and a lechi and a korah. You mamish would have to close it and make it an enclosed area to enable you to be able to, make an Eruv and then carry. Right? So Yerushalayim ilmalei dal sosan and alos balayla, if not for the fact that Jerusalem, they actually mamish close the gates every night, well then if you would carry there on Shabbos, you'd be chayav for carrying in Rishus Harabim, because then you wouldn't be able to do anything to be able to carry there. The only reason you can carry in Yerushalayim is because they mamish close it off. Ve'amar Ula, and says Ula hani avule de Mechoza, that in the city of Mechoza, they also had these gates. Ilmalei dal sosen and alos, if not for the fact that they locked these gates, or they closed these gates, you'd be chayav for carrying in Rishus Harabim. So we see that you can't do anything to be able to carry in Rishus Harabim. So how could it be that, back to our case, where we said, how can you carry in Rishus Harabim? How can you make an Eruv in Rishus Harabim? Tanakama said, easy, just put up a tzuras a Pesach on one end and a lechi and a korah on the other end. Right? Then Hanani quoted a Machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, where Beis Hillel, of course, we paskin said that, just put up a door on one end, and then a lechi and a korah on the other end. But that won't work. When it comes to Rishus Harabim, you can't carry there. If you want to be able to carry, as we saw by Yerushalayim and by Mechoza, you mamish have to close off the city. Amar Rav Yehuda, so says Rav Yehuda, Hachi Ka'amar. Now friends, listen up. This is what the machlokas between the Tanakama and Hananya is about. Ketzad me'arvin mivoos hamifulashin. This is a new concept. By a mavui hamefulash, by an open mavui, right? So let's say, take our regular mavui, turn off of Main Street into an alleyway. But in this mavui, it's not a dead-end mavui. You can walk straight through to the other end of the mavui and go out to a different Main Street. Let's call it Main Street 3. Because Main Street 1 and Main Street 2 were perpendicular. But let's say you can walk straight through the mavui, not an L-shaped mavui, you'd make a left, but let's say you walk straight through the mavui from Main Street 1 to Main Street 3. That they're parallel. Okay? So that's a mavui hamefulash. And says Rav Yehuda, machlokas between Tanakama and Hananya is about what can you do to be able to carry in a mavui hamefulash. Not a Rishus Harabim, a mavui hamefulash. Ketzad ma'arvin mavos hamefulashin, the Rishus Harabim, right? A mavui that's open to Rishus Harabim on both ends. Osid tzuras haPesach mikan v'lechi v'korah mikan. So the Tanakama says, on one end of the mavui, you would put up a tzuras haPesach, and on the other end of the mavui, then you just need the traditional lechi or korah. Itmar, and then of course Hananya, meaning he's just giving you a taste, and then of course Hananya would disagree and say that you quoted Machloz between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai would say you'd have to put up mamash a door at both ends and close it behind you. Beis Hillel would say that just a door on one end and a lechi or a kor on the other end. Itmar Rav Amar Yuchsa Tanakame Ushmuel Amar Halacha Ki Chananya. So it was stated that Rav says that the halacha is like the Tanakama, that in a mavui hamefulash you put up a tzuras pesach on one end and a lechi or a korah on the other. And Shmuel says that the halacha is like Chananya, that meaning, and therefore like Beis Hillel, that you would put a door on one end and then a lechi or a korah on the other end. Ibayalahu, they ask a kasha. The Chananya aliva de Beis Hillel tzarich lino lo ein tzarich lino. We saw that Beis Shammai's opinion is that you would have to put a door at either end of the mavui hamefulash and keep it closed. And when you leave, you have to close it behind you. Beis Hillel said that you put a door on one end, and the other end has a lechi or a korah, but he doesn't say if you have to make sure that the door is closed at all times. So the Gemara wants to know, according to Beis Hillel, do you have to make sure that the door is closed all the time? Or can it just be open? Does it have to exist, but it can be open? Tashma da Amar of Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Eino tzarich lino. So Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel that you don't have to lock the door, you don't have to close the door. V'chein Amar of Masna Amar Shmuel, Eino tzarich lino. Rav Masna also says in the name of Shmuel that you don't need to close it. Igad Amar of Masna. There are those who say that Rav Masna said it's not just simply that Rav Masna said in the name of Shmuel that you don't need to close it, but he actually says B'didi Ava Uvda. There was actually a story, an incident. V'amar li Shmuel ein tzarich linol, and Shmuel told me we don't need to close the gate. So in a mavui hamefulash, it's enough just to have the gate the door according to Beis Hillel, but you don't necessarily have to close it. Ba'u minei Rav Anan tzarich linol or ein tzarich linol. They asked Rav Anan, do you need to close the gate or not? Amrlahu tachazi. So he said, come and see. Hane avule de narda. The gates of Narda, the timan ad palgayu ba'afra. They are mamish covered halfway up their height in dirt. Va'ayil v'nafik mar shmuel v'lo amrlu v'lo midei. Meaning they were so entrenched in dirt that even if you wanted to close them, you could not. And still, Shmuel would, walk around over there and not say anything. So we see that and Shmuel, of course, held like Hananya, right? We said Rav held like the Tanakama, Shmuel held like Hananya. And by holding like Hananya, of course, you hold like Beis Hillel, not like Beis Shammai. And Shmuel didn't seem to have an issue with the fact that you couldn't actually close these gates. So it seems that according to Beis Hillel, you have to have the door to the mavui hamefulash, but it doesn't have to be closed per se. Fine. Amar of Kahana, Hanach Megufo Savoy. So if Kahana responds to Rav Anan, it says, you can't necessarily prove from that story that, right from the fact that the gates of Narda were so covered in dirt, and nonetheless Shmuel would walk around over there. That's not a proof, because actually they were covered in dirt, but they got stuck in a position where they were like mostly closed anyways. So you can kind of theoretically consider it like it's closed. So therefore, Rav Kahana is not saying that they necessarily have to be closed. He's just saying that you can't necessarily prove from there that they don't have to be closed. Kiasai Rav Nachman, when Rav Nachman came to town, or when Rav Nachman came to Narda, now Rav Nachman, I think, lived in Narda, didn't he? I think Rav Nachman lived in Narda. He was also a student of both Rav and Shmuel, as we saw on Shabbos Daf and Aleph and Aleph, I believe. So Kiasai Rav Nachman Amar, Panua le'afrayu. So when Rav Nachman rolled into town, he said, clear away the dirt from these doors. Le'ema kasav Rav Nachman tzarich lino. So does that imply that according to Rav Nachman, you have to lock the doors? You have to close the doors? Lo, kim deruyas lino alfabish lo ninalos. No, he doesn't say that you have to close the doors, but you have to at least be able to close the doors. Right? Once you're able to close the doors, well then you don't necessarily have to close them, but you have to at least have the option to be able to close them. Hahu mavui akum de hava ben arda. There was a certain crooked mavui that they had in Narda. So we saw a crooked mavui earlier that was an L shape. This was a shtickle fancier. It was a chet shape. So you can mamish, on Main Street 1 on the bottom Darton, you can mamish turn into the mavui, walk all the way to the end, make a left into the next part of the mavui, and then make another left to go into the third part of the mavui and come right back out on the same Main Street one. So it was the shape of a letter chet. Now we saw the machloket earlier between Shmuel and Rav, where Rav considered these different sections to each be a mavui hamefulash. Shmuel considered these sections to each be a mavui sasum. Look what they did over here. How mavui akum, so there was a certain, slanted mavui, Tahava ben Arda, there was an Arda, and it was the shape of the letter chet. Ramu ale chumrei de Rav v'chumrei de Shmuel, and they applied to this mavui the stringencies of Rav and the stringencies of Shmuel. Right, the stringencies of Rav in that they treated it as a mavui hamefulash, which means that you wouldn't simply be able to just put a lechi at each of the two entrances from Rishus HaRabim, and you would also have to put a tzuras HaPesach at the end of it. But then they also took the chumras of Shmuel, which is that when it comes to a mavui hamefulash, it's not enough, right? He passes like Hananya, who says that it's not enough to just put a tzuras HaPesach like the Tanakama, rather you have to mamish put a door over there. So they took meaning, whereas according to Shmuel, when it comes to a mavui akum, so he treats it like a mavui sasum, in which case it's not a mavui hamefulash, you don't have to worry about this tzuras HaPesach or doorway thing. Right? But they were machmir like Rav to consider it a mavui hamefulash, and then they didn't take Rav's more lenient remedy to mavui hamefulash, which is to put up a tzuras HaPesach. They then took Shmuel's more stringent opinion regarding a mavui hamefulash, which is that you mamish have to put a door in. So I'm going to read that again. Mavui akum Tahava ben Arda. There was a certain tilted, slanted mavui that was in Narda. Ramu ale, and it was a letter chet. Ramu ale chumrei de Rav v'chumrei de Shmuel, and they applied to this mavui both the chumras of Rav and the chumra of Shmuel. V'tzechu dulasos, and they required that at the end of each of these mavuis, there had to be mamish doors, not just a tzuras HaPesach. Chumrei de Rav d'amar torasuk mefulash. So they applied the chumra of Rav in saying that we have to treat these mavuis like a mavui hamefulash. Ve ha'amar Rav halacha k'Tanakama. But one second, didn't Rav say that the halacha is like the Tanakama, which means that if it's a mavui hamefulash, you would only have to put a tzuras HaPesach at the end? Why are they putting doors at the end? So Kishmuel, the Amar halacha ki Hananya, well, because it's like Shmuel that says that the halacha is like Hananya, who says that the halacha is like Beis Hillel, that you have to put doors on a mavui hamefulash. Ve'amar Shmuel terasu kisasum, but didn't Shmuel say that when it comes to a mavui akum, we can treat it like a mavui sasum? So why do you need either a tzuras HaPesach or doors bichlal? So Kirav the Amar terasu kimefulash, well, because they were machmir like Rab, who says that we treat mavui akum like a mavui hamefulash. Okay, so the people of Narda, they wanted to be very, very, very machmir, very fancy. Umiyavdinan katrei chumrei. But says the Gemara, that's not really the way to do things, friends. We don't just apply all of the stringencies of everybody. You don't just say, well, let's just take the stringencies of Rav and the stringencies of Shmuel and be extra stringent. Be'atani, we learn in a brayso, Olam halacha k'Beis Hillel. The halacha is always like Beis Hillel. Okay, now interestingly, then the brayso continues, V'arotelasos k'divir Beis Shammai osa k'divir Beis Hillel osa. Okay, and the Gemara is going to talk about why this brayso seems to be contradicting itself. On the one hand, we're saying the halacha is always like Beis Hillel, and then we immediately say, if you want, you could do like Beis Shammai. If you want, you could do like Beis Hillel. Okay, we'll talk about that. But in any event, the brayso says that if you want to do like Beis Shammai, you can do it like Beis Shammai. If you want to do like Beis Hillel, you can do it like Beis Hillel. Mikule Beis Shammai, Mikule Beis Hillel Rasha. If you decide that you want to do like both the kulas of Beis Shammai, the leniencies of Beis Shammai, and the leniencies of Beis Hillel, well then you're a wicked person, you're a Rasha. Michume Beis Shammai, Michume Beis Hillel, and if you want to take the opposite extreme and say you're just going to be, do the strict ruling, the strict rulings of Beis Shammai, and the strict rulings of Beis Hillel, whichever one is stricter you're going to do. About him, the pasuk says in Koheles that the fool walks in darkness. Ela ikebeis Shammai kikuleon uchichumeon, ikebeis Hillel kikuleon uchichumeon. Rather, if you want to do like Beis Shammai, gewalt, but jump in, go all in. do like their chumras, do like their kulas. If you want to do like Beis Hillel, amazing. But also, do like their kulas, do like their chumras. Don't just take both the kulas of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, or the chumras of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, right? So, therefore, the question is, how come in Narda they decided they were going to take the stricter teaching of Rav, the stricter ruling of Rav, and the stricter ruling of Shmuel to say that by this mavui akum, we're going to treat it like a mavui and mafulash, and then also fix that mavui by mafulash by mamish putting in a doorway. The chumrah of Rav and the chumrah of Shmuel. Now the Gemara gets sidetracked for a minute to get back to that original question that we asked a minute ago, which is, why did the Brisa start off by saying that we always paskin like Beis Hillel, and then it said, if you want to paskin like Beis Shammai, that's fine. If you want to paskin like Beis Hillel, that's fine. But just choose one of them and go with them the whole way. So Agufa Kasha, this is inherently contradictory. Amart le'olam halacha ke Beis Hillel. On the one hand, you said that the halacha is always like Beis Hillel. V'hadar amart, but then you said, Harot halasos kedivrei Beis Shammai oseh. Oh, you want to do like Beis Shammai? Okay, no problem. Didn't you just say that the halacha is like Beis Hillel all the time? Lo kasha kan kodem baskol, kan lacher baskol. So, before the voice came out of heaven and said that we always paskin like Beis Hillel, so then if you want to do like Beis Shammai, no problem. But once the voice came out of heaven and said that we always paskin like Beis Hillel, well then, you gotta go like Beis Hillel. And that's the Reisha where it says that we always paskin like Beis Hillel. V'ba yisema, hava lacher baskol. Or you could say that the entire Brisa is talking about after the voice came out of heaven and said that we always paskin like Beis Hillel. So why does the Seifa say that you can paskin like Beis Shammai? Rabbi Yoshua, that is the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua says we don't pay attention, we don't heed to a baskol. Baskols are cool, but that doesn't have a bearing on halacha. And therefore, even though a voice came out of heaven and said that we paskin like Beis Hillel, that's really cool. It must have been really cool, but the fact of the matter is, it doesn't have any nafkaminas la'alacha. And therefore, you can still pass like Beis Shammai if you want to, according to Rabbi Yoshua. Or if you want, I will say, Hachi ka'amar, this is what the Brisa is saying. That it's not saying that you're allowed to pass like Beis Hillel or Beis Shammai, whoever you want. No, after all, we have the Baskol that says that we pass like Beis Hillel. Rather, what the Brisa is saying is that kol heicha de mishkachas trei tanoi v'trei amoroi de plige adode ke machloges Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, that whenever you have two tanoim or two amoraim who argue with each other, just like Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argue each other, right? Meaning in the same way that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argue with each other, so whenever you have, chvais nish, abai v'rava, whatever it is, two tanoim, two amoraim who argue on each other, lo le'avid ki kulek demar v'chi demar. Don't just do like the kulas of this one and the kulas of that one. Or not, don't just accept upon yourself the stringencies of both of them. Ella, rather, choose a side, choose your guy, and then go like him throughout. That means accept upon yourself his stringencies, accept upon yourself his leniencies. But don't kind of pick and choose, even if it's to be more strict. Don't pick and choose. Rather, choose a side and go with them arasof. Friends, we'll stop here, even though it's a shtickle in the middle, but we're already like a few lines into Daf Zayin, and it doesn't really end until about 2/3 of the way through Amud Zayin, so we'll stop here. Let us review what we learned. So the Daf began with a discussion about breaches in the walls of a mavui. So we saw machlokas between Rav Chanan bar Rava and Rav Huna arguing about what Rav's opinion is. Rav Chanan bar Rava said that his opinion is that a breach is considered a breach only when it's more, in a mavui, only when it's more than 10 amos. And Rav Huna says that it's already considered a breach when it's 4 tfachim. Now, we then kind of massaged this machlokes and came to some realizations, which are that when it's a place where lots of people are walking through, such as in this L-shaped mavui, where you have lots of people walking there, well then, even if the breach is 4 tfachim, it would already be considered a breach, and that's why in the mavui akum, it's considered a mavui hamefulash, according to Rav. Now, if it's a place where people don't really walk there, maybe because there's lots of trash over there, and there's a breach over there in the wall of the mavui, and not only is there a breach in the wall of the mavui, but there's still like 3 or 4 tfachim worth of stones, so you're kind of gonna have to hop over some what are those words? What's that word? Obstacles. well then even Rav Huna admits that as long as the breach is 10 amos or less, your mavui will be intact. Where Rav Chanan bar Rava and Rav Huna argue, it is in a place where people don't usually walk there, but if you do trek out there, you would be able to walk right into the mavui. There, Rav Chanan bar Rava says still the breach would have to be more than 10 amos to be significant. Rav Huna says no, 4 tefachim is enough. Then we talked about mavui hamefulash, which is the first time that we really interacted with a mavui hamefulash. And we said that a mavui hamefulash, which is a mavui that is open on both ends, right? It's kind of, you have 2 parallel Rishus HaRabims, and you can walk straight through the mavui to get from one to the other. So how can you carry in there if you want to carry in there? So the Tanakama says that, well, you just make a tzuras HaPesach on one end, then on the other end you put either a lechi or a korah. And Chananya, was there actually a diagram of that? Whatever it is. Chananya says that it's a machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai says they have to mamash put a door on both ends of the mavui hamefulash, and when you go in and out, you mamash have to keep it closed. Beis Hillel says you put a door on one end, and then the other end can have either a lechi or a korah. And we say that, okay, and then there was a discussion, do you actually have to close this door? And the assumption seems to be no. You have to have a door, but you don't necessarily have to close it. Rav paskins like the Tanakama that all you need is a tzuras HaPesach. Shmuel paskins like Hananya, which obviously we would paskin like Hillel, which is that you need to have a door over there. And both Rav and Shmuel agree that on the second side you would have to have either a lechi or a korah. And at the very end of the Gemara we started talking about this machlokas between, well not machlokas, but this incident in Narda where there was this chet-shaped mavui where they adapted both the stringencies of Beis Shammai and of Rav and Shmuel to say that it is both a mavui hamefulash and that in order to be able to carry that, you'd mamish have to build a door over there. And we're now trying to understand how come these people adapted both chumras of Rav and Shmuel, and we will continue with that tomorrow. Chevra, have a great day. Peace.